He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of not one, but 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, a 25-year veteran advertising strategist. And together, we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing conversation about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. Henry, we're back, and we're going to continue our conversation from our previous episode on multicultural ad agencies and the role that the strategist plays in writing a brief. So you talked in the previous episode about the macro and the micro tendencies that you had to keep top of mind when you were addressing a client's issues and writing a brief. I wanted to follow up with a couple of more questions. So when you are working with the creative department, you need to play the role of seeing themes that can work out that are relevant to Hispanics when you're writing a brief. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So after we brief the creatives, they go off and they do their work, and then I'm going to see the work at some point. I'm invited to a meeting where they're going to show the work. And really, I think as a strategist, I take on a role that maybe in the general market, the strategist doesn't have to take on, but that's to identify things in the work Hispanic or can lend themselves, if they're tweaked, to kind of have more of a Hispanic flair. So now we're getting more into the executional, right? So we were talking about at the brief stage what the strategist or the brief writer does. Now we're talking about at the creative evaluation phase, bringing up those, oh yeah, that's a very Hispanic, or it brings up an idea of how to punch up the Hispanic aspects of the creative. So I think that's something that any strategist in a multicultural agency has to have, that additional filter as they're evaluating the creative. It's like, if you're an African-American strategist and an African-American agency, what's African-American about it, or what can we do to make this feel even more insightful and truly reflective of the culture? I do the same with regard to Hispanic.
Well, that must provoke or inspire some interesting conversations with your creative department, because at a multicultural agency, your creatives are going to have a multicultural background as well. So they'll have their own perspective on what does it mean to be Hispanic. Talk about the nature of some of those conversations. Did they get heated? Did they get, is there disagreement? What happens?
No, generally. So one of the things that is a true of most Hispanic agencies, I'm talking specifically here about Hispanic, is that the creatives tend to live in more of a general market advertising world in their mind. So they're trying to solve the problem, and they're not always looking for that Hispanic angle. They might bring some uniquely Hispanic things, but often they're not thinking, they're first trying to solve the problem. So I'm there to kind of be like a blind spot mirror to say, hey, can we infuse it with this? Or did you think about that? And often those conversations are very productive. It can also help, as we're evaluating creative, we might have a phenomenal idea that doesn't have a lot, quote unquote, Hispanic about it. And that's a whole other discussion that we didn't really talk about, which is sometimes the problem that you're trying to solve in the Hispanic market is different than the problem you're trying, or what the advertising you're trying to do in the general market. And so by nature, by solving a different problem, the work is going to be Hispanic because it's solving a different marketing problem. Whether the work has cultural values reflected in it, or those kind of visible, tangible things about Hispanic culture in it, because it's solving a different business problem or a different communication problem, it's going to be Hispanic. But that aside, those conversations generally go well. They all know we're here at a Hispanic agency. Some of them are better at bringing a Hispanic perspective to the table than others. But we always have to remember we're not the target, because even though we might be Hispanic, I don't like using the word we in front of clients. Like, I don't represent all Hispanics. I'm telling you about this particular target audience, and that's the way that I approach it.
How often does it happen that an idea that you generate for a multicultural brief ends up being the creative for the general audience?
More and more recently. So, and it usually depends on how invested the client is, not financially, although that's a part of it, but invested in the Hispanic market. So there is something to be said about creating Hispanic work in both English and Spanish, usually with a pretty strong Hispanic insight or Hispanic bent to it, and then running that creative in the general market. And lo and behold, sometimes even though the idea originated in the Hispanic market, it has a lot of value in the general market. And it's for two reasons. I think one is sometimes the Hispanic agency just hits it out of the park. And I've had examples in my past where the client loved our work and they ended up hating the general market work because in execution, at the end when everything was produced, the general market work was somehow found lacking and the Hispanic work was better. The other part of it is that general market audiences today are diverse and they embrace diversity. And so when they see a brand explicitly embracing minority consumers, they feel good about that brand. So there's a rub-off effect on those consumers regarding it. But yeah, I've got, examples of Hispanic work that, either there was no general market, it was intended for the Hispanic market, and then it went into the general market and there was no corresponding general market work, or that they liked the Hispanic work better, or that the Hispanic work lived side by side with the general market work in the general market media.
Henry, we both are teachers. We both share our knowledge, especially with younger workers or students. So I'm going to ask you to take your strategist hat off and put your professor hat on and offer some advice to multicultural strategists on what they can do to enhance their careers.
Yeah, so you had asked me earlier a really interesting question about, is Hispanic market limiting to Hispanic advertising professionals, and particularly strategists and brief writers? And my answer is no, but I've never tried to make the jump to the general market. There's some real practical personal reasons for that. I happen to reside in Miami. This is where my family is. This is where my kids are. There aren't a lot of general market shops in Miami. There's a couple of really big Hispanic shops, and I'm at one of them right now. So I'm kind of like in the big pond of where I currently live. So I don't have really a need or a desire. But I don't see working at a Hispanic or a multicultural agency as a limiting or handicapping factor. In fact, I see it as a benefit, because we have all these aspects that we bring to the table we have to be strategists first, and then we have to be subject matter experts on African Americans or Hispanics or Asians or LGBT or whatever the segment that we're working on is. So I don't see that as a negative. And as a job candidate, my advice would be to market it that way and say, yeah, I've been working in a Hispanic shop, but that just means I have an additional set of skills to the skills that a good strategist requires. And I've had to walk a lot of thorny issues like the ones that we've been talking about, justifying the work and helping to sell the work to clients. So I think that it's not a handicap at all.
Good stuff, Henry. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Howard.
Okay, Henry, for our creative review today, we're going to take a look at a spot by Diesel, the fashion company, and this is done in-house. And the director is a guy named Johnny Dufort from an agency called Dobido. Let's take a look. Okay, Henry, what are your thoughts?
So interesting, definitely a little creepy. Look, in all candor, I don't have a ton of experience in the fashion category. Some way back, like 20 years ago, but it was like B2B in fashion. Diesel is a brand, from what I know, that has a very large following. It's a very strong brand, one of the most recognized and desired brands in kind of accessible fashion. So my take on it is it's definitely attention grabbing. The not only those abnormally large smiles that are kind of in a way off-putting, and the Ad Age article talks about this being like a surrealistic approach. But the Ad Age article also mentions that this clothing is kind of nostalgic. This is an old line that they've brought back with some adjustments, but you can kind of see that nostalgia in the sets, the computers, the interiors of the houses. It feels kind of 80s-ish. Like it's trying to capture that. And in a way, I think that those smiles kind of maybe represented. That's the thing about modern art and surrealism is all up to the interpretation. But I think it's kind of that way that we all view nostalgia, right? It kind of makes us smile, and these exaggerated smiles represent that. But I think my overall verdict on it is a lukewarm thumbs up. I don't think it's gonna. I think the brand is powerful enough that fans of the brand will look at it and be, find it quirky and cool, and they won't be turned off by it in any way. And it definitely grabs attention.
Yes, in another episode, either before this one or after this one, I've sort of forgotten, we talked about the value of knowing other creative to bring ourselves into the know about what other brands are doing in the world, so that we can have a broader perspective and not suffer from myopia. So I recognize the fact that this is not a brand that's targeting me. I have owned a pair of Diesel jeans way back when. So what drew me into this and what makes me admire this spot from a creative perspective, but also from a creative brief perspective, is the compelling nature of that creepy smile. The very creepiness of it drew me in. And I recognize, how do other brands do that? How do they accomplish it? And they, many have succeeded in finding that hook to grab me to sell the product. Now, the question I ask is, as try not to see this as a consumer, but to see this as a practitioner, is, does that creepy smile draw me, pull focus? It's a term that we use in the performance arena. Does it pull my attention away from the clothes, or does it simply enhance as you said, the surreal nature of the campaign? I'm not certain. Because I don't know where how this is working out in the world, but I see the value of this bizarre thing that happens on the faces of the models, and I can't look away. I mean, I want to look away because it is creepy, but it's like, oh, where is this going? So I give them, a thumbs up for that. Very simple. I mean, it's very simple. Nothing fancy about this technique at all. It's a little quirky thing that, let's see if we can do this with CGI.
Well, I think that's kind of the elegance of it, right?
Yeah.
Every brand is looking for a gimmick. Like, Liberty Mutual has an emu. Now they're copying, Geico and the gecko, right? Like everybody's got a gimmick now, but nobody's ever thought of doing like a huge, like kind of abnormally big smile. And so to me, it's novel. It grabs attention, and it might make you watch it a couple of times. And on that second or third viewing, you may just actually look at the clothes. So
yeah.
Who knows?
And the other thing I noticed is that as the models appeared, as the spot evolved, the severity of their smiles didn't seem abnormal on some of them.
You kind of get more comfortable with it.
Yeah, and maybe that's what it is. I don't know, but anyway, you gave it a tepid thumbs up. I would agree. It's a thumbs up, tepid.
Okay, great.
Good
All
stuff.
Right.
He's
Howard
Henry
Alba. And we
he's
step on
Henry
each other
Gomez.
again.
And we're together. We're the Brief Brothers. Having way too much fun.
Till next time.
Yeah. See you
Bye-bye.
later. Bye-bye.